the Trump administration, the first and then the second. And one of the things we saw was a kind of a weakening of relationships between the European Union and the United States of America. In fact, the fact that France has virtually opposed what is happening is symptomatic of the state of relationship. But the thing to note here is that the European Union and the United States appear at this stage not to be working in sync, which changes the dynamics from 1823, 1898. So that now you're in a world that is more multipolar. But before we get there, we also need to understand that between 1946 and 1989, after the advent of the Truman Doctrine in 1946, what we saw was the anti-communist struggle in which Truman declared they were going to contain communism. At that time, Europe and the United States were at one on the issue. We have seen the collapse of the Berlin Wall. We've seen the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of Russia. And we have seen the emergence of a multipolar world. And therefore, a lot of what we have to look at has to be taken in the context of the present multipolar world. Therefore, for me, the task for Guyana is to clearly identify where its national interest lies. To me, the national interest of Guyana lies in the protection of our territorial integrity. First and foremost, in the protection of our territorial integrity is the fight against Venezuela. I want to make it very clear here. We see Venezuela as an adversary, not an ally. But at the same time, we live in a complex world. At present, we are relying on the International Court of Justice to rule and to rule in our favor so that we can have a clear legal position on the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy. What is happening now is weakening international law, including international humanitarian law. And that has serious implications for us. Because let us not forget, we don't have the military capacity to fight Venezuela. Venezuela has far more military capacity than us. And therefore, as a nation, we are dependent on our rules govern international relations. And so our interest lies in ensuring that we are in a world in which there is the rule of law and the international law govern the relations we are having. This is not to say we are sympathetic to Maduro. In fact, I do not believe all that is happening is about Maduro. At another level, when we speak, I believe it has more to do with the petrodollar paradigm. And so I would say the task before us is to, amidst this complex multipolar relationship, to work out where Guyana interest lies, ensure that we move in the direction of pushing for the respect for international law, the respect for the rule of law, the respect for international humanitarian law, so that we can have the scope to operate. We have always taken the position that we oppose aggression because we ourselves are vulnerable to aggression. And when we are looking at this, we also have got to factor in Brazil. Now remember, Brazil has 10 countries on the border. As if I recall clearly, only Argentina and Ecuador in Latin America are not on the Brazilian border. And so Brazil is one of the countries that has been supportive of us, and therefore we have got to be responsive to the concerns of Brazil, who is an ally. I do not operate on the premise that China, Russia, or America come in to fight wars for us. I am of the view that those countries pursue their national interests, and I don't believe at this stage it is part of the national interest to fight for us. And therefore our task must be to ensure we can
has the president spoken to the opposition at all? I know there are some um, uh, issues with regard to the uh, presumptive opposition leader, but what has happened so far?
as far as I'm aware, they have not spoken to the opposition. Um, I am not aware at any stage that they did. What I can say is that in previous occasions, while I was opposition leader, they engaged. And in the first case, we give them our full support. In the second case, we support them against the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy. But we made it very clear we were unhappy that they were not being inclusive and that there were many things that they were doing that we didn't approve of. Additionally, we did say then that they made commitments with us when we were in Parliament. They made commitments on this issue. And then after that, they did not engage. So, as I see it, this state of non-engagement continues, which is not good for Guyana's foreign policy, because in the statement I made on the issue, I did say we need to forge an inclusive approach which allows us to unite in the light of the Venezuelan claims to our territory.
So how could we get on the same page, all of us as Guyanese, even as political parties? How could we get on the same page?
Well, what I did in my first statement was to try to suggest to the government that you need to involve all. I also made a number of proposals suggesting that one, we need to coordinate what we're doing. Two, that we need to forge a unity. Three, that we needed to set up, we need to prepare for any eventuality. And in doing that, I suggested that we needed to set up an area away from the border to ensure that we not only screen who's coming in, but be on top of the situation and provide the resources that were necessary. I also, in that statement, pointed out that we need to engage both the UN and CARICOM, as well as the International Red Cross, so that the economic burden doesn't fall on us alone, so that we can prepare for any possibility, including an influx of Venezuelans from Venezuela. So there were a number of things we talk about. We talk about intensifying the patrols and the controls at the border, which is critical to us. Now, I do not know how we can get the government to engage. I know at some stage they will be compelled to engage because it is not an issue that they can go alone. But to me, it is not just them engaging, it's them engaging and implementing after the engagement and ensuring that there is an inclusive approach to the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy.
How could the opposition contribute to a unified stance on Guyana's sovereignty issues? Shouldn't there be a convening of parliament and it be discussed there? Do you think that is an approach?
Well, I think convening of parliament is a normal course of action. So I see that as kind of self-evident that there's a need for parliament.
But you know, but you know there's another reason why they're not trying to call parliament. So I'm trying to figure out, shouldn't we insist on that aspect of it, as a Guyanese point of view?
As it relates to the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy, I would say they should call a special session on the parliament to deal with the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy. I see no problem with doing that. That's the first thing. The second thing is there are a number of outstanding things we had raised with them that should be done. One of them is that campaign in Latin America to keep people au fait with the situation. I did point out in many broadcasts before that a lot of people in Latin America do not know the merit of our case, and we need to ensure that they know it. We also said that there was need for special envoys to visit capitals and keep our position on the front burner in international relations. Look, we do not have the capacity for war. We do not want to be in a war of any kind. And therefore, we have to intensify our diplomatic approach to ensure that diplomacy works for us. And we do not end up in a situation where we are either in a war or a proxy war, whichever one.
A lot of people are saying that we got rid of Maduro, so I don't. I get the impression that they think that once we got rid of Maduro, we've gotten rid of the problem. At least we've gotten rid of the emphasis on the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy. But the vice president who has assumed the position of interim president of Venezuela, Ms. Rodriguez, is as much of a hawk on the Guyana-Venezuela issue. Do you think that we need to do a lot more in addition to the diplomatic outlay that you were talking about just a moment ago?
Yes, we need to. Look, I was never one of the persons who believed that the Venezuela territorial controversy is a function of the president of the day. This thing has historical context. It's a product of history. It's a product of the Cold War. And therefore, one has to recognize that this claim to Guyana's territory is not an individualistic claim. It is not a claim of a political party or the claim of a political president. It is a claim of Venezuela. In fact, in some regard, the Guyana-Venezuela issue has become what some theorists call a phenomenon sui generis, in the sense that it has generated a life of its own and it has taken on a life of its own, and it tends to transcend the government of the day. So the removal of Maduro will not solve our problem. It will not even contribute. You have the military establishment that has its position. You have the intellectual community in Venezuela that has its position. We have got to recognize that what would have happened will serve the interests of the United States of America. Now, I taught foreign policy for years at the university, and one of the first things you tell your students is that countries pursue their interests. And so I believe it will be naive for anyone to see the removal of Maduro as the solution to the problem. And even as the United States and others talk about change, to the extent that the same system is in place, when the individual has been removed, it does appear to me that in terms of the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy, the status quo continues to be there.
Well, with regard to the petro sector, so to speak, the oil sector, aren't the interests of the United States and the interests of Guyana conflating, so to speak? Because we are all interested in making sure that that sector continues to function, continues to produce for the economy, both of Guyana and the United States. So essentially, there is, for the time being, a collaboration because we're both interested in the same thing, making money from oil.
I would say there are points of conflation and confluence, and there are points of diversion. These things are never either or. In terms of uh, the US being an ally and helping us, yes, that's a point of conflation. But this issue goes deeper than Ghana, Venezuela. You know, I say to people regularly, countries pursue their interests. When people say to me the US wants Azrudin because of the sale of gold in Ghana, I would say to them, no. They have other strategic interests that they're pursuing. And that is the reason for which they want him. I hold no brief. I believe over the period from 2010, all that was happening was known. And therefore, I believe anybody who conflict with the law should face the law. I want to make that clear. But having said that, the United States has far greater interest in this than us. Now, I did point out that the world is multipolar. We are seeing a world in which previously the petrodollar dominated, in which the oil is sold in United States dollars, and therefore that constituted economic and political leverage. I think in the United States' attempt to sanction and isolate Venezuela, it opened new vistas for China, Russia, and others. And you see them beginning to do barter or trade in non-US dollars. The one in the case of the Chinese, the ruble in the case of the Russians, and we can run the gamut. Now, this shift away from the US dollar obviously became a key concern of the United States. And I believe in large measure, what you have is a conflict between two paradigms. The old petrodollar dominated by the US and the emerging agreements with BRICS and others. And so in that regard, the US has far more interest in dealing with Venezuela way past the Ghana-Venezuela territorial controversy. And therefore, what we have to do is to analyze this complex situation and create our own approach that allows us to keep pressure on Venezuela, while at the same time ensuring we have solidarity and support from the US in terms of protecting our territorial integrity, while at the same time not becoming embroiled in conflicts in which we have no capacity to handle.
I'm speaking with Aubrey Norton, the leader of the People's National Congress, on Capital News in Context, and we're discussing the Venezuela issue, particularly the arrest of Maduro and the implications and impacts on Guyana and for Guyana. And Mr. Norton, could I bring you in again? Because two things I want to look at here. One, this whole thing about international law, where another country, be it the United States or any other country, can move in past the borders of a state, pick up the head of state, and or any other citizen for that matter, and render that person into the custody of the state that is picking up the person, as against an extradition request, as against something else. The challenge has been, and we've seen it with several heads of state, with whether a head of state will willingly allow himself to be extradited or herself to be extradited. So that is one area. How do you see that from the point of view of another country, a big country like the United States, moving in beyond the borders? And when you've answered that, I then want to follow up on that question.
We have to see this from the standpoint of us being a small state in international relations. If you're a small state, you want the law to prevail because you lack the capacity to use force. And once you support the use of force against another state, you kind of axiomatically create the conditions for it to happen to you. With us being a small state like Venezuela, in conflict with Venezuela, we will have grave difficulties. And so I believe that there should be the promotion of international law. I'm, however, cognizant of the fact that when power exists and is concentrated, it has the tendency not to pay attention to law. And that is not only restricted to small states, it's also true about people in power. Let us remove a state. Once people have power and they can't get it during the legal way, there's the tendency to use extra-legal approaches. It is wrong, but it's the reality of the world. And so as a citizen of a small state, as a political leader in a small state, we will always support the upholding of international law and practices that make the situation for us more conducive to exist. And there is where our interest lies. Our interest lies in ensuring we help to carve an international system in which small states like us should not be taken advantage of.
So what stops, therefore, Venezuela in the coming time from saying, you know something, we have a Venezuelan criminal, we have a Venezuelan wanted man in Essequibo, and we are going to come in and pick him up, you know, and as we do, we might as well hold on in case we have some more that we want to pick up. What stops that principle from perpetuating itself?
Well, it's not a principle, it's unprincipled. But it's an unprincipled principle, if you want to call it that. But let us say this. Venezuela will be more constrained because though they are a bigger state than us, they are not really a big state in international relations. And they are big states to stop them. And that's why I say for us, it's of grave concern because we are extremely small state, under 1 million people. An army that is not competitive. And so the reality creates conditions propitious to Venezuela doing that. But there's another reality that Venezuela is not as powerful as some of the powerful states in international relations. And therefore they will have to calculate the risk and will not be likely to do it. But it creates a serious precedent in the world which we would want to go. I think one of the things we must recognize is that the United States is not a homogeneous country. United States is a homogeneous country. It's a country with different approaches. I believe the Democratic group were working on a rules-based international relations. I remember, I think his name was Joseph Nye, author of Soft Power, suggesting to the United States that they have more to fit from using soft power than a resort to force. There are people in the United States who buy that argument. And therefore, one has to recognize that governments change in the US. It's one of the elements of democracy. And therefore, there is likely to be a change in the present approach, even by a government that is Republican in the future. And therefore, as a country, we should not tie ourselves to things that are ephemeral and that are going to change, that are not constant, because we will be jeopardizing future relations in this international environment. And I would say to the government, whenever we speak, that we need to look at this thing as a dynamic something and not something that ends today. In 2028, there will be elections in the United States, if I recall. What that means is that by January 2029, there's going to be a new government. Would that government perception be the same as the present government? Would they continue the same approach? So I would say We have to prepare for all eventualities, and we have to analyze the situation and ensure we pursue Guyana's interests and not be caught in the bind between states that are bigger than us, that can help themselves when we cannot.
When I was in a courtroom, I'm trying to get in, actually, because we had to wait a long while to go upstairs to the court room itself, or one of the courtrooms. And there was a Venezuelan opposition person as a member of the public, and he was pointing out that the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, had done various things that hurt persons in the country. And at the end of the hearing, one person got up and made a remark towards towards Mr. Maduro and his wife Celia. Outside of the court, it was a lot of protests and what have you. Now, that brings us to whether the same opposition type people will seek to either go back to Venezuela or stay out in the migrant communities, either in Colombia or in Guyana or in Brazil, wherever, or here in the United States. How should the Guyana government deal with a possibility of a migrant crisis, or even from the point of view of a humanitarian position? How should Guyana deal with that, Mr. Norton?
Let me start by saying we're not sure where this will go. I don't anticipate Venezuelans going back, even if they will in the long term, right away, because the situation is so fluid, they don't know. And secondly, those who would have run from the Maduro regime will see the present vice president as being in charge, regardless of what anybody says. So they are not likely to go. And then you will have in Venezuela the pro-Chavistas or the pro-Maduro people who see it as an affront. Now, we have got to keep our eyes on the dynamics of Venezuela. But like I said in my first statement, and that is why I did that, because for me it's the major concern, there is the possibility of people exodus in Venezuela. And in that process, Guyana will be one of the destinations. And that is why I said very early that we need to have a coordinated approach. We need to set up an area away from the border where we can accommodate Venezuelans, screen them, and ensure we are on top of the situation rather than allowing people to just come and end up in our society. We have no records of them. I mean, if you follow the numbers that the government gives to the opposition in parliament about Venezuelans in the country, if you go in any one region, they got more Venezuelans in the one region than in the where they give for 10. So we need to become in charge and in control of it. I have also argued that in whatever we're doing, we must not have them in Essequibo. They should be in Demerara, at least for now, or Berbice. Essequibo is under claim from Venezuela. Venezuela is an adversary, and we cannot allow a population buildup in Essequibo. And I've made that point. But the bigger problem is that the government does not have a migration policy. And to the extent that you don't have a policy, the government apparatus is not guided as to what they should do. So one of the first things they need to do is develop a proper policy. The second thing they need to do is a proper intelligence network to know what is happening. The third thing they need to do, and I'm not putting them in order, is to engage the stakeholders in Guyana to ensure we are all united against Venezuela. Now, I believe if we can do those things, if we can agree in principle that our most important question is the protection of our territorial integrity, then we should have an approach that is symptomatic of that, in a way in which We can always have continuous meeting at the parliamentary level, at the security level on this question of Venezuela, so we are on top of it and ahead of the game. Of course, I'm assuming that the government leaders do option analysis, though I don't see evidence of it, and they have analyzed every possible option and come up with plans to deal with every option and plans to deal with where there are options that merge. And so I think that comprehensive approach is needed.
No, shouldn't there also be a sensitization program with regard to information? Because I'm hearing a lot of people saying, we don't want these people in our country. We don't want this kind of person. We don't want that kind of person. So with regard to the migration policy, as you're saying, we're not hearing much of that with regard to the census. We don't know what is happening or how many people we have. But Guyana traditionally has been a migrant community, even if it was by force with regard to the enslavement of Africans, or by subterfuge with regard to the indentureship period, Indians and Portuguese and Chinese coming in. And at one time we had a Bajan influx, a West Indian influx. I think even you are part of that heritage. So essentially, Guyana needs data and Guyana needs a sensitization. Don't you think so?
It comes to governance. Governance is the way you govern a country. If you have good governance, if you're focusing on transparency and accountability, if you're focusing on equity, then you will be compelled to do the work in terms of the census, to have the data, so that your decisions are informed by data. It is clear that this government is not a data-driven government. It is a government that is driven by economic opportunities, by transactional benefits. But we need to shift to a point where we have governance that is premised on data, governance that looks at the interests of the people of Guyana. Guyana needs an immigration policy badly. You are bordered by countries that have problems. And even in countries that do not have problems, there's the tendency to migrate. We have migrants from Venezuela. We have migrants from Brazil. We need a migration policy to be able to enable us to be in control of what is happening in terms of the information on people, what people do it, and how they do it, and to have it linked to law enforcement. So when there is the violation of law, the matter can be dealt with.
But the government is talking now about an arrangement with the United States to accept third country deportees, so to speak. Do you believe that Guyana should adopt a more restrictive approach to its migration? Or
yes, I do. Guyana is an ethnically divided society. And that means almost immediately that it has its own internal problems. It also means it has diverse culture. It also means that all don't agree. If you have migrants coming who you don't know who they are, where they are coming from, and you know for a fact that they are not part of your culture, you would need to have a migration policy that allows you to get in your country who you desire to have. A country can make an agreement with you and say, we send in criminals. But when they don't arrive as criminals, Do we have the capacity to check to see if they aren't criminals? We don't. Do we have the capacity to know their academic abilities or lack of it? We don't. I am not opposed to migration, but I oppose to us taking deportees willy-nilly. Guyanese deportees, I think we are compelled to take them. But I'm saying to you, that should not extend to any state being able to send who they want, when they want, how they want. We need a more structured approach in which migrants become part of our development process and contribute to the improvement of Guyana rather than coming and being a kind of a burden to Guyana. We are already arguing in Guyana that even with oil, the resources are not meeting the people. Do we want to bring more people in which resources will have to be taken to help them, which means deprivation for us? I don't think we want that.
Which brings us to a segue, Mr. Norton, on this program of Context. I'm talking with Mr. Aubrey Norton, the leader of the PNC, former opposition leader in Guyana, on the whole issue of the arrest of Maduro and Venezuela-Guyana relations, and of course what is happening in Guyana. Earlier in the program, you talked about the government focus being on transactional issues, on economic priorities, and so on. Having said that, there's this bubbling issue of corruption, and the Minister of Tourism, as Guyanese is the name getting called. How do you see what is happening with regard to that issue with Susan Rodriguez and acquisition of property, as if government ministers can't acquire wealth? How do you balance things out there?
Let me put it this way. I don't think the issue is that government ministers shouldn't acquire wealth. The wealth should be gotten within the confines of the law. Once it transcends the law, it becomes corruption. And that is what the objection is. We have been opposing corruption. We point out many of these corrupt activities. But I also believe that the government itself cannot deal with the corrupt amidst itself because they all have things to expose each other. You know, I make the point to somebody who was telling me about how Mohammed is making disclosures. He was part and parcel of the corrupt regime. He has inside entree, for the want of a better word, to the corrupt machinery in a way that the APNU will never have, though we have been exposing corruption. And so I believe when we talk about exposing corruption, you yourself must be above the law, above the fray. You must not be accused of corruption. Now, as it relates to Susan Rodriguez, it does appear to me, I don't care what family wealth she talks about, it does appear to me that she could not accumulate the wealth that you're seeing. In fact, most PPP ministers cannot explain their wealth. Over the years, I have said regularly that if Jagdeo and company could put their wealth against their earnings and the two match or against the requisite loans, I was prepared to resign. But they can't take up that offer because they just cannot. Corruption is endemic in the Guyanese society. It has arrived at the point where the president himself is now saying we got to deal with corruption. But who charges Caesar to be tried by Caesar? Caesar will find himself not guilty. So,
which is where we began. Which is where we began, because Transparency International defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain.
Correct.
And therefore, how should such accusations be investigated to ensure fairness and accountability, Aubrey Norton?
I have long argued that it has to be a change in the government and system. The government is corrupt. Corruption is interwoven into their fabric. And therefore, for them to challenge corruption is to challenge themselves. In fact, what the government does is include more people so that there are more people corrupt who can talk. That's one of the strategies the government uses. So I do not anticipate that this government will be able to investigate itself. If you look at the direction of the government, control of the police force, control of the Ghana Defense Force, control of the constitutional institutions, the change in the Natural Resource Fund, you will see the setting up of an authoritarian system so that they cannot be investigated.
And so what are you doing about it? What is being done about it?
You can expose it, which we have been doing. You can educate people on it, but you need to become involved in mobilizing mass support to challenge it. And not only in Guyana, if you do the study in Nigeria, if you do the study in a lot of countries which oil emerge, the tendency of the government is to use the resources at their disposal to control a broad section of the society and delay it. I think the time is coming when the people of Guyana, because of the cost of living and a number of other things, will challenge the regime. It is for the opposition to be organized, proactive, and recognize that it will demand a group with integrity that cannot be challenged at that level, or else you have nowhere to go. One of the things we must observe about exposure of corruption, a lot of the people who are exposing corruption are people who are involved in the corruption. And when they fall out with the government, they just bring out the information that they have. But that doesn't challenge the system. The system needs to be challenged.
So there has to be issues of public trust in government as a result of that. How do we work to ensure that, as Transparency International and various other NGOs have been saying, that people have confidence? You know, the worst thing somebody could say to me as a journalist is, you know anybody at, you know, the license office, you know anybody at this place so that I can get ahead, or if I can pay somebody to get in. That tells you systemically we have a problem. So shouldn't we work towards regaining public trust in government?
But I just said that in the first statement by saying about education, about activism. Look, we have got to pay workers proper wages and salaries, or else right away they are vulnerable. We have got to change mindset. You talk to some young people and they see corruption as a normal part of life. Ghana has changed in that sense. It is not a case where the corrupt is questioned and challenged. Some people begin to see corruption as the means for them achieving what they want. And like I'm saying to you, unless the system changes, unless there are systemic changes. I've met persons who said to me, you know, a lot of them people got the money, nobody care how they get it. We got to get it just like that. So when you get comments like that, you recognize the problem is systemic. It also has to do with our educational system. If you have an educational system in which children are left behind, they are not going to be in a position to do the analysis to recognize what they are doing is damaging themselves. We have people who are engaging people and comfortable with the people who are responsible for them being in poverty. So we have got to educate them on poverty, the sources of poverty, and then articulate to them positions that will help them out of poverty. You're dealing with a real situation in which over the last 20-something years, the government has undereducated, ill-educated, and miseducated young people to the point where a few come out extremely good, but the general public is in a difficult situation. One young man told me, boy, this life is a hustle. And if you're hustling, you're in this life.
Mr. Norton, that's exactly what I was going to ask you. People are going to say, well, what Aubrey Norton talking about there?
And that is why I say it has to be long-term. Education, a number of things, because we have allowed a hustle culture to develop in Guyana.
And haven't we also not put enough pressure? We have a commissioner of information. We have a lack of census data. We have issues where sometimes the police do not even report traffic deaths and certain other aspects of their operations. We have, and I can go down the line where information is not there. And so to even investigate matters, like what we're hearing here with Rodriguez said, look, she's been responding, but people are still are looking at other aspects of this. So data, information shouldn't, as opposition parties, you guys pressure the administration to ensure that we have the data available.
It is not just pressure the administration, you have to pressure the administration. Look, when the Vice News thing came out, we keep consistently calling for an investigation into Jack Dale. The police, they are not budge because they are totally controlled. You mentioned the Commission of Information, a former PPP Attorney General, a hardline PPP person that will give no information. And that is why I said they've set up an authoritarian system. That is compounded with the fact that the government has instilled fear in the wider society. And for you could bring the pressure, but having brought the pressure, you want people to act. You have to remove that fear. In the public service, you have virtually placed everybody on contract. So if you say or do anything against me, I am renewing your contract. Are you really not no recourse to the law because you're not a public servant on the fixed establishment? You are looking at the dismantling of a complex authoritarian and dictatorial system in which you have to deal with a number of issues. And so I would say to you, yes, you have to apply pressure, but you also have got to do the work to dismantle the barriers. There are two ways those barriers are dismantled. One, through education and people becoming active, or three, some event occurred or done by the government is so outrageous that the people themselves act, and then you give it leadership. Those are your options.
Mr. Norton, before we close this program of context, looking at Guyana and looking at Guyana-Venezuela relations and current issues in Guyana, what message would you send to citizens who feel disillusioned by repeated corruption scandals? What are they supposed to do? So let the hustle continue?
No, that the real power in this country or in any country lies in the people. And unless the people rise up and take the action necessary, then the government will get a free pass.
But the Guyanese people got too much fight to fight.
Well, you see, you're
What
coming
they
back to
come
what I
in,
said.
lighters go off.
So
Too many
you're coming
fights to
back to,
fight.
you're coming, but even with all the fights to fight, history has shown it only takes one event to change it dramatically and traumatically.
I've been speaking with Aubrey Norton. He is the leader of the People's National Congress, the PNC, that is a dominant part of the Partnership for National Unity in the National Assembly. And he has been the former leader of the opposition. Mr. Norton, thank you so much for appearing on Context.
Thanks for having me.
We will gather again to look at other issues.
I'm so assured of that.
Thanks so much, and thank you for joining us on Capital News in Context.